picked a paper that's been at least discussed at our department quite a lot, because I picked it for my own group seminar because I thought it was important. And at the same time, I had also picked it for this group because I thought it was perhaps not astrobiology, but something fairly close to astrobiology at least, and something that it's important for us to know about, I think, the discussion that goes on. And then during this time, I also learned that Mark picked it for group discussions in Anthony's group. So whenever I don't understand the pictures that I'm going to show you, I'll call on Mark or perhaps Daniel in Anne's group, who know a lot about this, because I picked something that I'm not so very well familiar with all the methodology actually, but it's something that has interested me quite a lot. And as you understand, it's about when did mammals actually arise on Earth? Did we come about just because the dinosaurs were extinct, or were there other evolutionary trends that actually made us appear, and it didn't have so much to do with dinosaurs going extinct, or were the mammals actually the cause of the dinosaurs going extinct? And so I'll give you a little bit of background first. The kind of methodology that we look at is something that we use within biology quite often. Actually, we compare different characters between organisms. And before you had the molecular biology tools, what you used to do then, just to take an example, what Linné used to do, is he would look at flowers, for instance, and count how many flower leaves did they have, and if they had the same number of flower leaves, that would be a common character. If they had different number of flower leaves, that would be a character that differed between the species. And in that way, you could compare many different characters, and so in the end, you would end up with perhaps two species that had 9 out of 10 characters in common, and two other species that had only 2 out of 10 characters in common. And from that, you could construct a tree about how common they were, or how related they were to each other. And that will be the kind of trees that you quite often see in biological literature. So this would say that A and B are more related to each other than they are to C. And so before you had molecular tools to work with, of course, you had to look at macromolecular characters like that. And we all know that macromolecular characters may not always tell us the truth, just as molecular biology tools do not always tell us the truth. But with the molecular biology tools, we could start comparing nucleotide by nucleotide between the genes of organisms instead. And of course, then we have a lot more things to compare. And if you're a microbiologist and you haven't thought so much about other ways of looking at comparing species, like I did in the beginning, actually, when I started to think about comparing nucleotide sequences with each other, you quite easily get the impression that these are more exact than comparing different characters. I'm not quite sure they are, actually, because now we know that pieces of DNA jump around, so it's not so sure that when you compare things that you think are the same, that they actually are the same. So even though you have many more nucleotides to look at when you do the comparison between with molecular biology tools, I think in a sense you still have a bit of the same problems that you have if you just look at macromolecular characters. But so this is one piece of background that you need to the thing we're going to discuss today. And another piece of background is that even though you compare species like this, it is very hard to say how long time passed from when we look at A and B, if those are now living organisms that we can go around and sample today. How long time passed from today and to the time when they diverged, when they were one species and started to be speciated into several species. And again, from molecular data, one has, this is my pictures, my pause program. But so from molecular data, one has thought that it would be very easy because we generate so much data to go back in time like that with a timeline. But actually, when it comes to DNA, that evolves or changes with different speed, depending upon what kind of DNA it is. If it is a DNA that codes for a protein, for instance, the constraints might be very high because the protein or the enzyme that is the product of the information you have in the gene may have to look a certain way, and so the genetic code cannot change much at that point. But if you look at the region that lies in between two genes, that may have higher freedom of changing. So when you look at rates of how much difference you have between DNA samples, it is very hard to actually tell the timeline because the difference here, the rates here are quite different depending upon which parts of the DNA you look at. And so in order to do something about that, what people do is they try and find other ways of dating a point like this. And the way to date a point like that is to go and find a species that fits with what would be a common ancestor of A and B, and find that as a fossil, and then date the fossils. And so in that way, you can get some dating on these trees. So those are kind of the methodological backgrounds. And then let's see if I can wake this one up again. Yes. And so, whoops. So there has been quite a big discussion actually about major transitions that may have appeared on Earth, and I think it's a common sense actually that we had impacts like this. And I'm sorry for this part of the graph is in Swedish because I took it out of a Swedish newspaper, but I think you can still understand what it means because it's a picture. But so we had large impacts on Earth like this, and the one that we will deal with now is the one that's called number 5 here. And this is the large impact on Earth when it is said that we had a meteorite hitting the Earth and the dinosaurs went extinct, and after that the mammals started to diverge. This is sort of what we learned from newspapers and from a lot of popular science books. And I also believe that because it triggers your mind in a way, I think. Dinosaurs are big and scary, and the first mammals were small. and so already in childhood you get triggered by thinking about the big dinosaurs. And I think when I started to be interested in the discussion was when Anne's supervisor, I shouldn't say previous supervisor, but Anne's supervisor for his PhD came here and actually talked about why do we have to connect geological things that happen on Earth together with biological evolution. Do they actually have something in common, or isn't it so that biological evolution occurs with or without geological things or big geological impacts, and big changes like this has happened not only here but actually throughout the timeline on Earth. And so the paper that I choose now is one of the first papers that actually try and tell us that there were quite a lot of diversification among mammals even before the large impact 65 million years ago. And so what this paper tries to kill in a way is the notion that every kind of life that we see on Earth today is here because of everything going extinct, more or less, 65 million years ago. And so what we will deal with is the division here between Cretaceous and Tertiary in time, which occurs 65 million years ago. And so the group that has done the major experiments that I talk about is this paper that you read, and what it does is it puts 4,510 different species, molecular data from 4,510 now living mammalian species together. And this is quite an effort actually, because it is 99% of the mammalian species that we know of on Earth today actually. And so what they have done is taken data from other groups, smaller parts of data, and putting them together into a big connection table like this, which we also call phylogenetic trees. And so what they used for the molecular alignment of sequences were 66 different genes among those mammals. And of the genes that they compared, 32 were nuclear. That means that 32 genes were on the chromosomes and were coding for proteins. 19 genes were tRNA genes. So those are the transfer RNAs that carries around amino acids to the build-up of proteins. And 15 of the genes came from mitochondria, so the small energy making factories that we have that also have special genomes, the mitochondria. And together with that, they also used 30 fossils for calibrating the timelines. And so this is the tree that they came up with. You see it doesn't look exactly like this one, so they do it on a circular scale instead to actually have chances to give all the different names here. And I'm not that kind of biologist that I would know what all of these different names mean in Latin actually. But so I did something for my own and perhaps for you also. So the red up here, or orange, it is marsupials. The primates are down here. And the rodents are this group, I think. And over here we have several different groups. Horses and things like that are over here. Carnivores are here, and so on. And over here, so one could say that from the red here and all the way over to the blue here, it's true placental animals, animals that have a placenta. Marsupials, as you remember, are animals that actually have their babies in a pouch until they have grown. And over here, are monotremes, which we only have 2 or 3 living species of, and those are, Daniel, help me.
Not the egg-laying.
Yes, they are egg-laying. Yes, nebule and yes, but what are they in English? Platypus, right. But so I think you can see, instead of having the tree looking like this, it is now like squares that divide the different species. And the dotted line that you see here, this is the timeline for the KT boundary, so the boundary between Cretaceous and Tertiary time, 65 million years ago. And there is also a timeline here, actually, so you can follow it backwards. And the important thing that came out of this study is that quite a lot of the diversification of modern day animals, all of these are now living animals that we see here, occurred actually long before we reached the 65 million timeline. And for a number of species, like if you look over here, it is so that there seemed to be a gradual diversification of different families. You don't see that they diverged much here and then quite a lot later. It's only, the authors say at least, that perhaps here among the marsupials you see very little happening before 65 million years ago, and then it looks like you have a burst of diversification later. But the main issue from this is that it doesn't look like we had very, very few mammals up to the point of 65 million years ago, and then everything bursted away and started to speciate. And of course, you don't have to look at it only like this. You can actually do statistics out of it. So you can look at how many different lineage can you count on the tree that I showed you versus the timeline. So when you start out, you have very few lineages, of course, and then as time comes closer and closer to present, the number of lineages that you can count become more and more. And the red line here is the KT boundary in this case. So the boundary between Cretaceous and Tertiary 65 million years ago. And when you do the comparison, you only come into very confident data up to about this point here, where you have less than 85% difference between the data you compare. But still, they draw this blue line here for all mammals that they have looked at. And then if they look only at the placental animals, that's the green line over here. And since the placental animals, as I showed you on the previous slide, are the majority of what they compare, this will, of course, follow the one for all animals quite close. And then they do the same things for only marsupials. And so what you can see from this is what I tried to point out from the previous graph, that you have already from here, about 100 million years ago, you have a rather gradual decrease of the number of lineages within the mammals that you look at. If you look at all of them, if you look at placental ones, and if you look at the marsupial ones. But of course, you also see that the timeline or the number of lineages sometimes go up rather abruptly, and other time periods they move or they get increases to a lesser extent. And so what you can do is you can of course calculate this as a rate. So the rate of diversification instead, which is more or less how fast these numbers raise here against the same timeline. And if you then calculate it for shorter geological periods of time, you get the square kind formation that you see here. And so, for instance, here you have a rise from 2 to perhaps 4 or 4 animals or so, and that will come out like a race here. And then you see that the rather steep race here, of course, is represented by something rather steep here also. And then the fairly steep race over here we can also see in this graph. And then they do kind of a smoothing of the same type of data, and then they get this kind of curve here, the blue one, that they show with plus minus 5% confidence interval. And so the important thing here is that there was a rather high rate of diversification for the mammals at around 80 to 100 million years ago. There was very little diversification of animals shortly after, or of mammals shortly after the KT boundary. And then we see the, if we should call it present day or whatever, the diversification that we see here now. And one thing that is important to remember when we look at data like the one here that from which the previous graph was derived is that what we can compare with molecular data, which is what I have compared here, are only extant, now living animals. We can't go, well, we could in theory perhaps pick up DNA also from extinct mammals, but that would be very, very few actually. So in essence what we see here is just the evolutionary tree of the mammals that we have today on Earth. And then we come to this graph over here, which I have a hard time understanding actually, and I know that Daniel helped me last time I tried to show it. But these are fossil genera that you will find on the same timeline as we find over here. So in the paper it was actually together with that one. And here it's shown fossils, the number of fossils that you will find before, not the KT boundary, but the boundary that's about here actually. So we can follow how much the fossils seem to tell us about diversification of mammals. And then this is how much the fossils tells us about diversification of mammals that are living today, I think. But can Mark and Daniel help me now? Did you get something else out of this picture?
I think the brown line is from lineages, from old lineages that diverged earlier, so that they diverged at the 100 and 150 million years ago. And then the blue line is from later diverging families than the other one.
From after this Eocene warming
right.
period.
Yeah.
The brown is before, the blue is after.
I think it's the height of the peaks that's telling us that what we see in the B picture is not really the whole picture, but that there was perhaps some kind of diversification between those two peaks that are shown in the B picture.
So what you should do is sort of take the fossil data and extrapolate that together with the data that you have here of the extant animals. But anyway, I think even with that picture superimposed upon this one here, what we see is that there was fairly little happening in the period here. And so, together with the paper that I picked out was also a News and Views article by David Penny and Phillips, I've forgotten his first name. And what they showed is kind of the same data that came out of the Belinda Edmonds paper. And it's actually a picture that they have in their supplementary material. And so it shows kind of the same thing, that if we look at, we can start with marsupials here, the grayish line, so they were, and we have the KT boundary again, they were rather steady here, and then they started to diverge over in Miocene. And if we look at Lauracetheria, among which are hedgehogs, moles, whales, dolphins, hippopotamus, cattle, and bats, we see the same kind of picture here again. And if we look at supraprimates, rodents, rabbits, hares, flying lemurs, and primates, the picture is roughly the same again. And if we look at Afrotheria and Xenarta, to which belongs elephants and anteaters, again, we have roughly the same picture. Very little happening here, actually, but much out there, and some diversification already before 65 million years ago. And what Penny and Phillips points out in their article is that the one about mammals is not the only one, but there also was a study performed by Eriksson et al., and some of those authors actually work at the Natural History Museum here, so by paleontologists, and they were doing the same thing for birds. And what Penny and Phillips point out in their article is an article not by Eriksson et al., but a comment to the Eriksson article from Brown et al. And this was the first one I read, actually, but then I went back to actually read the Eriksson article, so we'll start with that one. And so what Eriksson et al. Did, they looked at 87 now living bird species. They looked at 5 different nuclear genes, and they used 23 fossil calibration points to get the timeline. And so this is what their data look at. And again, I don't know much about birds, so I don't know much about the names down here also. But I think you can look at these little squares here. So they tell you where they had their fossil calibration points. And what was rather new to this study was that they used many different rather recent fossil calibration points rather than one very old fossil calibration point down somewhere here. And so if you then use the fossil calibration point and put this on a timeline, and I've turned it around because otherwise it would be so small, but so here now you have the KT boundary again, as it says. And so if you look now, so what Eriksson et al. Said that some speciation among the birds occurred before the KT boundary, but most of the speciations occurred afterwards. And as you see, it is the same picture in a sense as from the mammals, that you have a gradual specification into different families and lineages, and not a very sharp burst here around 65 after the KT boundary. And so what then Brown and Payne and Mindel did, like half a year after the article by Eriksson et al. They said that you've used the wrong method to calculate everything, and you've used bad dates for the fossil records that you've introduced. And so Brown et al. Recalculated Eriksson's data according to what they thought would be a better way of doing it. And now you see with the KT boundary here, everything more or less moved back. There is not much difference in the real data. It's just that the time, the diversification times have moved backwards. And in green, they show with the confidence interval that they pick out from the fossil records all the speciation that occurred before the KT boundary, and in blue, with the error bars, all the speciation that could have happened after 65 million years ago. And so if you look at a picture like this, you would say that quite a lot of the bird speciation occurred before 65 million years ago, which would be a very, very strong support for what the article about the mammalian diversification also said. But if you then read more carefully, as I did after a few days, Eriksson actually have made a reply to the comment by Brown et al. To their original article. And so they say, no, we have not made anything wrong with the fossil dating. We took the mean time of the fossil dating, not the oldest time as Brown et al. Had took. And there were also quite a lot of other comments about methodology that I cannot follow. But so I think after reading these three articles, my impression is that we're back to the Eriksson et al. Data actually for the birds. And so what all these pictures come around to is that something happened, a big impact happened on Earth 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs went extinct at about that time, and we see a lot of mammals appearing on Earth after 65 million years ago. But do all of these three things, are they actually connected to each other? And I think if you go back to a paper by David Penny and Matthew Phillips from 2004 in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, you get quite a good background about how to think about the data that we have right now. And so what they do here is that they show 5 different models that you could start thinking about when it comes to the diversification of mammals or of birds. They take it as examples here actually. And so they have their KT boundary here in their models. And the different models are like this. So model A, and I should say, I will go through them A to E, but I should say that model E is the one that they think should be the one that you try and ask your scientific questions around actually, and to me seems to be the model which fits best with what we have seen so far. But so what model A would say, and these are then theoretical lineages of birds or animals. So what model A says that a single lineage survives at the KT boundary, and this is the one that gives rise to everything that we see on Earth today among mammals or among birds. And what model B says is that a few lineages survived this mass extinction or the great impact 65 million years ago. And you have lots of diversification here. And then when you come to model C, you have many survivors that come across the KT boundary, and you have more diversification occurring here. And then in model D, you have many survivors with diversification after 65 million years ago, but also some diversification that you can follow that happened before 65 million years ago. And then model E, you have lots of diversification occurring before 65 million years ago, and not so much extra diversification has happened after 65 billion years ago. And so what they also do in their article, which I discovered too late actually, so I would say I recommend, for those that are interested in this, I recommend you to read also this 2004 article, because I think it's a very good article and easy to read. But so what they show us for different scenarios is, for instance, we could live with a scenario that we like in children's books and so on, that the dinosaurs lived on all the way up to the KT boundary, and then they went extinct. Or we could think about the scenario where some dinosaurs started to go extinct earlier on, and those are then what Penny and Phillips talk about are preferentially small dinosaurs that disappeared. And the different scenarios for C here, that diversification of modern mammals or birds started to occur earlier than the KT boundary, but for instance this one would be similar to the model A that I showed earlier, that the diversification of mammals or birds did not start to occur until you came to the KT boundary. And so if we then go back to the pictures that I've showed you, this one where we see, even with the stricter timeline, we see some diversification that occurred before the KT boundary. And the very first picture that I showed you, this one, where we also saw diversification among the mammals before 65 million years ago. You can start asking the following questions, and that's where I actually will end. How many lineages of mammals and birds survived across the KT boundary, rather than did mass extinction of non-avian dinosaurs trigger the evolution of mammals? And of course you can start turning all the questions that you have around in a similar fashion. So rather than asking, did mammals start to diverse because dinosaurs went extinct, you can ask, did dinosaurs start to go extinct because mammals started to diverse and actually predate on the dinosaurs rather than the other way around that we try to think. And in the Penny and Phillips article from 2004, they bring out many examples, and I'll take just one for you actually to start thinking, and that is that small dinosaurs, they don't stay in the same niches all the time, so the young animals go away to other niches than where their parents live, and so they leave their parents quite early. And so even if you're a small mammal, it's not so far-fetched to think that a mammal could actually start feeding on the baby dinosaurs of the smaller dinosaurs rather than the dinosaurs feeding on the mammals. And so the main issue that I think come out of these articles, as I said, is yes, we know that there was a major impact on Earth 65 million years ago. We know that dinosaurs went extinct, and we know that we now have lots of mammals on Earth. But to think that these three things are connected is actually making a good story out of something, but not a scientific connection that we have yet. Okay, open for questions. But you see, by the way, that even I think it's so nice with thinking about the dinosaurs that I couldn't help putting this little thing down at the bottom of my slides. Okay.
I noticed that on this diversification rates that you showed as a function of time, what I noticed was at the wrong point, because I didn't look so much at the 65 million years, I looked recent. They all go down. Is there some obvious systematic
Yes,
reason that one doesn't see any?
we should ask someone else, because I wondered about that also, and I didn't find.
Or has evolution stopped?
You mean this one, or
Yeah.
or that one, perhaps?
Almost.
Yeah.
Everything always goes down.
Right.
But that's the rate. I mean,
So, anyone that's more familiar than I with this, could you help? Anthony,
Well,
Mark?
it's talking about, I mean, as it says on the side there, it's a net diversification rate, so it's still diversifying, it's still above zero even when it's dropping, so you're still getting general diversification across that. So if you compare that to the tree, you're seeing that as you go towards the center of the tree, you have fewer lineages, but it's constantly expanding. It's just that there seems to be periods where there is greater expansion. I think that it's difficult to I think it might be somewhat difficult to understand fully, because you will see more diversification at the tips, simply because we're describing species at the tips, whereas down further back you're then describing very wide-sided groups generally. So it's a natural tendency to see that. I don't know whether there's a biological explanation for why, as to why there's an extensive, if there's been a radiation, for example, in this Miocene period that they show in this figure here. I haven't got an answer to that.
That's what you mean?
No, this
No.
Penny
Okay.
in Philip's picture. That one as well, where you see these several different groups of mammals apparently having a high net diversification rate around the Miocene period. I don't know whether there's an explanation for that, or whether that's a true biological pattern of some kind. I have no idea.
Is there any idea what actually caused the real peak at the 600,000 years ago, 600 million years ago?
Here, you mean?
Sorry, I got confused. No, yes, this is the last peak at it's more like
600,000.
600,000 years, exactly. What caused that peak then?
No, I'm sorry, I don't know.
I think maybe there are different.
What?
I mean, there are different explanations, and I think one of the lessons from this is that there are biological explanations and there are perhaps geological explanations. And so far, we've been looking. When we're looking at these peaks, when we mass extinctions or mass diversifications, we've been looking for geological explanations for that. And to some extent, I think there may be one or two geological explanations. The blue line, for instance, is Afrotheria, which may be connected to the Gondwana, when Gondwana was dividing up. But at the same time, it's a lot broader peak than perhaps is explainable by the geological. So we need to find some kind of explanation here, which is I think it's a lot harder to explain these peaks than we have thought so far.
I mean, what would be possibly the nature of such an explanation? I mean, is it different from the current hypothesis that mass extinctions of the form that we discussed here could be responsible? I mean, is there an alternative here that you are thinking of, or would it still be within the same class? In which case, one may be as worried as before.
I don't know whether we have evidence for a mass extinction.
Yeah, yes. So therefore, there's. So what? But what do you mean by geological?
I think geological explanations could be mass extinctions like the KT event, but could also be that the continents are dividing up or fusing or something, and thereby connecting or disconnecting species, creating new species. But
yeah.
In addition to that, we need to look for biological explanations also, that there may be a critical mass for when when populations are big enough to start diversifying, for instance.
But in all these cases, one could still classify this as catastrophes somehow.
Not really. I mean, there could be very sudden events. That's a catastrophe. But I mean, there could be a very dynamic period of things happening. That's also a great pressure to, of course, for evolution.
And
I guess what's
I think the whole idea behind this is to say that there weren't perhaps catastrophes to explain everything, because biological evolution occurs anyway, actually. So species disappear and other species take over, and as soon as some species disappear because of a geological event or because of biological evolution, of course there will be niches that can be occupied by others.
I mean, catastrophe is not the right word, obviously, because it's slow. But
the key thing is that there is a statement in the original ideas that were popularized after Alvarez's paper showing, hey, there's been an impact, and then we don't see any more dinosaurs, and it seems all the mammals diversify shortly after that. The argument was being made that here is a non-biological event that is cataclysmic for certain groups, and that other groups were completely held in check and then went crazy directly afterwards, so that there was a massive increase effectively in the rate of speciation events directly as a result of this. So what biologists are now saying is, well, we don't see evidence for that when we look at, in fact, actually fossils and also the rates of, and timing of diversification of lineages. And even among, if you look more fine-grained at the distribution of types of dinosaur fossils, as was shown in one of the figures we showed, that there may in fact be there may be some effect associated with that. Perhaps the impact finished off some of those dinosaur lineages that were left, but if some of the smaller dinosaurs were already being outcompeted from niches because of mammals appearing or other non-avian dinosaurs appearing, then that's indicating perhaps that there was a biological process at work there, and that all that happened was perhaps some of the other lineages that may have disappeared anyway, not part of the KT impact. And then the diversification of mammals didn't speed up at any appreciable rate. There wasn't a mass radiation. And one of the reasons that biologists get upset by that is that we don't have any real mechanisms that enable biology to speed up as a consequence of things being available. People often have this idea in their heads that, oh, well, if you don't have any competitors, you can radiate very rapidly. But there are many, many good examples from particularly when you've had exotic species brought into new countries, so like European species brought into countries like Australia and New Zealand, and in very, very short spaces of time, like a few generations, human generations, you've had a wipeout of multiple other species because of the introduction of one species, and that they will rapidly change in terms of what they were doing in their original country to what they're doing in the country that they've now colonized. So a good example are the opossums, the marsupials from Australia, introduced into New Zealand, I don't know, 100 or so years ago, and have decimated numerous species, and in fact moved from being vegetarians to egg eaters. They start eating and snatching birds' eggs, native birds' eggs, thereby decimating not only the vegetation but also the bird life. And that you could consider it effectively a small-scale extinction event catalyzed by the introduction of one species, and that's happened in such a rapid space of time that we can document it in recent history. That hasn't required that the possums suddenly radiate into many different species, but it has resulted in them absolutely wiping out the competition in several different niches. You see the same thing happening with rats being introduced, and all that. You see this, of course, the other way with exotic species being introduced into Europe. Sometimes they just do nothing and they die out, and other times they just reach plague proportions and knock out several species. And that we can see, but that's not the same thing as massive increased rates of speciation of new species. So we can see biological reasons for that without needing to knock everybody off with an asteroid impact. That can happen regardless of there being competition present. If you're two competitors for the same environment or on equal terms, you don't really know which way it's going to go. But if one is just so much better, it doesn't really matter whether the competitor is there or not. They just wipe the floor with them.
Then I also think that it's important to realize that the net diversification rate is a function of two processes. It's speciation and extinction. So that there's a peak in or there are peaks in the Miocene may also be a function of lineages, older lineages going extinct. That the speciation rate may have been the same throughout all time. It's just that what those peaks are showing is that the modern lineages arose in those days, and they may have replaced other lineages that radiated earlier, which is not shown in this, but that
that we can pick up via the fossil.
Yeah, the fossil picture tries to show that, and I think it's kind of hard to interpret it. There is a signal that there was more diversification than the other diagrams show earlier in this mean time between the two peaks. So it may be just that there was a time of flux.
So in other words, when you showed this, the alternative models, 8 through E, there you actually saw all the different extinctions, for example. And along those there may have been, of course, diversifications which all got lost, of course, they were never recorded. And they may have occurred during those minima, in which case the diversification rate may have been quite different. So this, of course...
But these were theoretical models.
Yeah, of course, exactly.
Yeah.
So one can never observe those, unfortunately, but they may, those kind of pathways, of course, do occur.
So all the lines that are not reached up to here, these are things that went extinct.
Yes.
So here you have everything going extinct at 65 million, whereas here you have other things that come along a bit but then go extinct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, were the papers hard to read for those that are not biologists? Okay. I thought they were pretty hard to read actually for a biologist. Okay.
But in a way, we're back to the ideas that were around before Alvarez and co-workers popularized the idea of impacts making species extinct, because before that we had other explanations for why dinosaurs disappeared and mammals got more common.
Like food.
Yeah, dinosaurs.
No more food and things like that.
Things like that.
Global
So
cooling maybe
it
also.
was a very short period where we believe that impacts were the explanation for everything.
But it's something that is easy to grasp actually,
Yeah,
because you don't have to have much knowledge. I mean,
And it
impact,
scares everyone
extinct.
today as well.
Yes.
Actually, one point that was made in this News and Views and Victor touched on as well is if you think about mammals, one difference is that they, of course, provide for their young, so they're all lactating, so therefore they have milk. And you compare that to, say, large modern reptiles, things like Komodo dragons or alligators. Those have basically zero parental input, and they move through a range of different niches in going from an alligator that size to something that's a couple of meters long. And at any one point, if one of those niches were compromised, say for example they were outcompeted in a juvenile period by other insectivores who are picking up little insects when they're very, very small, then they will never reach adulthood because they outcompeted at an early stage of development. And so any one of those points could be a vulnerability. Compare that to mammals, where the adult is providing resources up until the point where the offspring is able to provide, gather those same resources themselves. They're completely protected by the abilities of the adult, so they're not pushing between different niches. Any one of those niches in a reptilian life cycle could be a weakness, they could potentially go extinct. So that's been brought up in terms of what may be happening with the dinosaurs, but of course we know that plenty of reptiles did survive that period and have that type of strategy. So those could be the ones that made it anyway. But perhaps that could be grounds for an ecological explanation for dinosaurs being outcompeted by mammals.
And also one thing that Daniel brought up when you and I discussed about it is that one would actually like to see a similar phylogenetic tree for fishes also, or animals living in the sea. Because this impact is said to have had a larger effect on animals in the sea than on land actually. So that would be very interesting to see what such a tree would look like.
These fishes, they all definitely diverge well before, so you will get a picture like that. Whether the net diversification rates are impacted in a negative way. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily expect a mass radiation of fishes, but you might see a correlation between the impact and then big numbers of genera, and I have no idea whether that's something.
What are the insects doing in this context?
Insects seem to be fine too.
Insects are said to be the part that has the highest diversification, or the highest number of different species nowadays.
The real reason for going for mammals and birds is that they are directly related to that event, in that it was thought that mammal radiation primarily occurred after the 65 million years ago, and that the birds may or may not have been dinosaurs but primarily diversified after that period too. So that's why there's a fuss about those, because those lineages were thought to be quite young and may coincide with that effect, and that's what those papers are now debating.
Okay, but I mean, we are talking about myth. What is the time interval of dinosaur extinction? This is not like an impact, a couple of weeks, right? This is a couple of million of years or so.
I think that's what Kenny and Phillips are trying to say. Actually, they had a picture in their paper. I can draw it out perhaps. I didn't bring that in, but they did something like they looked at dinosaurs from fossil records and according to size, rather than trying to group them into different groups. Maybe we should take this one away. different periods, Cretaceous, and then they have CMP, what is that? Help me. MAA. I guess this is the timeline here. Niels, do you know?
No, that's new to me.
Okay, let's see.
CMP.
Cretaceous, early and mid Cretaceous. No, Cretaceous,
EMP. Early
Camp-
mid.
Campanian,
Oh, that's Cretaceous.
and Maastrichtian.
That's earlier. No. That's a pretty. That's periods of Cretaceous. I don't know.
So this is 74 to 65 million years, and this is 140 to 83, I think.
Okay, so the rest is early Cretaceous.
Right, and so then they look at smaller dinosaurs that were less than 2 meters between the wings, I think, is what they looked at. And so these are relative diversity. And so I think the point that I want to make here is that some of the dinosaurs started to go extinct much, much earlier than 65 million years ago. And so if I understand what they want to say is that they think for dinosaurs that this is not the case at all, but that dinosaurs probably followed one of these lines instead, actually, so that they started to go extinct long before 65 million years ago.
Is there a typical average species lifetime, such as 200 million years or 150 million years? I mean, the dinosaurs were around for 200 million years, right? I mean, they're very
Not the same species.
No. There's quite a big difference between the different periods, like Jurassic dinosaurs and Cretaceous dinosaurs. I don't think anyone can answer that, though, because we don't really know how you would define a species over a geological time. I mean, an example is the coelacanth, this coelacanth, this fish that sort of looks like a living fossil. It's kind of rare, but you find effectively the same morphology in in the fossil record 100 million years ago, something like that, and or even longer perhaps. And these fish look morphologically pretty much unchanged. But since we can't do the experiment of taking the fossil fish and the modern fish and seeing whether they're the same species, and of course our definition of species is whether they reproduce when they're given the opportunity to have sex.
How can you then say that they have diversified the others?
Well, we
So
can
you
say
can't
that.
even say the same thing.
Well, we can on those evolutionary trees. Every time you see one of these splits, like behind Victor there,
Yeah, but how
that's
do you
we can say that that's a speciation event, because each one of those A, B, and C there are modern organisms, and we know that each one is a species, and that's describing the pattern of relationships that underlying those three species. So A and B are closely related, and C is more distant, but they're all related on the tree. But if you take dead fossil coelacanth and then modern day coelacanth, they're probably members of the same lineage because the morphologies are so similar. But we know that there's not a direct correlation between speciation and morphology. So there are plenty of cases of, say, frogs that are vastly different species, but morphologically they're very, very, very similar. But we know that genetically they're very divergent. And so it's difficult to correlate something like that. And because our definition of species is to do with whether they can mate and have offspring, we can't relate species in an easy sense on the fossil record. So if we were able to say build our time machine and go back and fish out one of these coelacanths, I'd say chances are if we looked at its DNA, it'd be quite different from the modern coelacanths, and I bet you they wouldn't reproduce. But we'd still call them part of the same lineage, but we wouldn't necessarily know whether we should call them species or not, because the definition doesn't allow us to deal with that. We'd be scratching our heads for a while, probably.
So donkeys and horses are vastly different. I don't follow your definition of species.
So,
and for me, naively, to me this is a very closely related species, like we are with chimpanzees and and we are not really actually reproducing. So then,
no, I don't know how. I don't know whether anyone's done either of those experiments.
but we know donkeys and horses.
Yeah.
Are we getting into beer kind of discussions now? Okay, so one floor upstairs and in that direction is where the beer.